Great. All right. Well, why don't we go ahead and jump in? And as people join, they can catch up. Okay. So, welcome everyone to our final of the four-part Generosity by Design webinar series on using behavioral science to shape the donor experience. Today, we'll be talking about feedback and reflection strategies to help donors engage more deeply with their giving practice. You know the drill at this point, so I won't go over everything again. But again, I do have a request. We are asking you to please fill out the feedback survey at the end. So here is the QR code so that you can preload it on your phone or computer. You can drop the link in the chat as well. Thank you. Once again, if you're new here, I'm Julia Toffoli. I'm an associate managing director at Ideas 42 on our civil society team, which advances giving and civic participation. I'll be joined today by Tony Macklin, an independent philanthropic advisor and senior consultant for Daylight Advisors, a philanthropic advising ecosystem. So we'll come back to Tony in just a little bit. But first, I'll walk us through a mini refresher on behavioral science, a super quick look back at what we covered in the last three sessions, and a little bit of behavioral background on reflection and feedback, which Tony will cover in more depth. So if you aren't familiar with us, Ideas 42 uses insights from the study of human behavior to design solutions that address behavioral barriers across a number of different fields, including philanthropy. And in the giving space, we try to better understand donor behavior and the context in which donors are making giving decisions in order to make it easier for them to give generously and impactfully. So we do this in part by working directly with folks like all of you who work with donors to apply and test our insights and designs in the field. So as you've probably gathered by now, Generosity by Design is a culmination of our work over the last decade in an effort to knit together various insights that we've gathered into an overarching set of strategies that can help improve the entire arc of the donor experience. So we've done the first three sessions. If you didn't manage to attend in person, we will be sharing the recordings. And today we'll be wrapping it up with reflection and feedback, which creates opportunities for learning and feedback that strengthen donors' giving practice and hopefully make it more rewarding over time. So a super quick look back at the behavioral science. Again, we'll share links to the previous sessions if you missed them. So in session one, we introduced the concept of biases and heuristics. So these are the adaptive shortcuts that our brains take to keep us alive, right? And they can also trip us up sometimes. So we talked about how important it is that to have an environment that can, help mitigate those barriers, right? And how critical environments are in actually shaping whether and how biases and heuristics activate. In session two, we introduced different kinds of contexts, right? Both physical and conceptual. And in session three, we learned in sort of what we were learning about framing and choice architecture, we also learned that context can have a huge influence on mindsets, right? Not just decision making. For example, putting someone in an emotional versus an analytical mindset, which in turn can influence behavior. So again, that was a super quick review. But the kind of big takeaway here is that this is how our brains are. You can't really change your brain, but you can change the context. Unfortunately, the giving space is rife with obstacles that trip us up, but behavioral design strategies can help us mitigate those behavioral barriers. So we'll review some of the strategies that we talked about in the first session. Starting with attention and discovery, right? So attention is really about getting on a donor's radar when they aren't necessarily looking for something. And discovery is that moment something specific catches their eye and feels worth pursuing. So from emotionally compelling outreach to eye-catching designs, attention and discovery strategies are really about breaking through the noise and making sure that the right thing emerges. Then we have curation, which reduces an overwhelming field of options to a more trustworthy shortlist, and personalization, which goes even further, tailoring that shortlist or other content to make it feel like it was built for a specific person, right? So from expert curated lists and identity-based tags to occasion-based prompts and past giving recommendations, curation and personalization strategies are really about making the right choice feel obvious and feel like it's meant for you. Finally, we have framing and choice architecture. So framing is how the language and presentation of information shapes what donors notice and value. And choice architecture is how the structure and layout of different options can shape what they decide. So whether it's asset-based language and personal tone to maybe something like suggested gift amounts, defaults, streamlined checkout, framing and choice architecture strategies are about designing giving environments where the better choice is also the easier one. It's all about reducing friction. But wait, there's more. The strategies that we've covered so far are largely about a single giving moment, right? We're capturing that attention, we're guiding a choice, and we're helping to make that choice. So these are, like I said, all about reducing friction and increasing confidence at each stage in order to get to the gift. But what happens next, right? This is all great for one gift. But what if this gift is happening impulsively? Or what if many gifts are happening across scattered channels? Many people don't give as much or as intentionally as they'd like. It's not because we're not generous as people. Most of us are quite generous, but because there's really no structure to help them repeat, learn, and improve. So when I talked earlier about how the giving space is rife with obstacles, there's obstacles along the way, but sort of more generally, it wasn't designed with donors and giving practice in mind. So how do you close that loop, right? And go back to the beginning so that that gift doesn't just happen once, but it becomes more of a practice. So reflection and feedback are really about closing that loop, right? They turn isolated giving moments into an ongoing practice that can hopefully improve over time. But what does this look like actually in practice? No pun intended. Um, so we'll kick this off with a little poll, right? So think back over this past year. Did you donate to a friend's cause? Did you volunteer your time? Did you support new organizations or did you support the ones you've already given? Does your giving reflect who you are and what you care about? Let's see if it does. So, a couple of sessions ago, we asked you how you felt about generosity and your own generosity. Now, let's see how much you remember about it. So, we'll be going ahead and launching the poll here, see if we can get a little bit of data from all of you all. There we go. So we're asking you here essentially, how well do you know your own giving? Do you know how much you gave? Do you know where you gave? Is your giving planned or reactive? Maybe let's give it 15, 20 more seconds. All right, 5 more seconds and we can go ahead and close that poll and show everyone the results. All right, let me take a look here. We have, okay, most of you know pretty closely and have a little bit of confidence that you can recall the organizations. All right, I'm sort of a mix of planned and reactive giving, right? So I guess working in philanthropy, we might be a particularly self-aware bunch, but even some of us pros don't necessarily have a great sense of where or how much we give, right? Um, let's say about 4% of you said that you um, didn't have any, couldn't really say where you gave or how much you gave. So even, even for those of us who are sort of mired in this space all the time professionally, it's tough. It's tough to know. Um, And in fact, that's the case for most donors, right? So most donors give pretty impulsively or reactively, right? We're not, it may be prompted by an email, a movie, a friend's ask. There's not always a deliberate plan. And a lot of giving is one-off gifts instead of recurring support. It tends to be scattered across different channels. So it could be different credit cards at the checkout counter, different platforms, paper checks, stocks, crypto, whatever. Um, Records of someone's comprehensive giving are almost impossible to aggregate, let alone look at together, right? They all live in different places. And so without visibility into that big picture, it's really hard to plan, adjust, or improve. And on top of it, there's almost no social norms encouraging donors to step back and reflect. Unlike a lot of financial behaviors, right? You might have annual or even quarterly meetings with your financial advisor. Um, you might, talk to your friends about what they're doing. And there's really few opportunities in giving for donors to receive feedback about their giving and get a sense of what other people are doing. And so throughout this series, we've been talking about the gap between wanting to give and actually giving, right? That intention action gap. We talk about getting a donor's attention, helping them find the right organization, making the choice feel easy. And a lot of what we talked about until now, like I said, are really about intervening on the moment of the gift or leading up to the gift. So these tend to be visible one-off transactions that you can see, you can track, et cetera. But there's kind of a second gap that's a little bit harder to see and to design for. Um, Most donors have values and priorities that their giving doesn't necessarily reflect, right? It's not that they don't care or aren't generous, but like I said, the giving context makes it really difficult to align your behavior with your beliefs fully. And this kind of lives below the surface, right? This is giving as a practice is a little bit more invisible, could be ongoing. It's more about your values and your identity expressed over time. Um, and so reflection and feedback are really important because they can start to link the two together, right? How do you learn from all the different gifts that you make in order to start influencing the way that you practice your giving? But we've been talking a lot about reflection and feedback, but what do these actually mean? So, reflection at its core is really about serious or intentional thought or consideration. Self reflection might prompt an examination of one's values, preferences, experiences, or behavior, right? So, in our case, reflection means creating structured opportunities for someone to examine their own values, preferences, and behavior. This could be through self reflection, giving themselves feedback. Um, it could also, it could be virtual and a solo experience. So you could be doing an online profile building, onboarding process. It could be in person with somebody else, maybe an advisor. The poll that we just did together is an example of a self-reflection exercise. So just being prompted to do that put you into a reflective mindset and probably gave you some ideas about your own giving. Feedback, on the other hand, is the sharing of information about actions or behaviors back to the person who undertook those actions. So generally, this information is shared from an external source with the intent of shaping that person's future actions. So this could range from providing just simple data, how much you gave, to how many organizations, to more evaluative insights, right? How your giving compares to your peers or to your own stated goals. So again, like in giving, this could be providing donors with objective external information about their giving behavior and or how it compares to other metrics. And so, for example, the poll we just did was an exercise in reflection. If we had actual data about your giving, we could look at it and tell you, what changed year over year, how you compare to your peers, whether or not you did anything new. So that would be more along the lines of feedback. And reflection and feedback work essentially because of how we're wired to seek consistency between who we are and what we do. So we tend to think of ourselves as certain kinds of people, right? We're thoughtful, we're intentional, we're strategic, maybe a little forgetful, what have you. So we often tend to assume that if we are those people, that's how we must be, right? And if you're not looking too closely, it's kind of easy to put on those rose-colored glasses and say, like, yeah, of course, I gave super strategically this year. Um, but if you take a step back and look at your own behavior a little bit more closely, either voluntarily through a reflection exercise or through external feedback, It becomes a little harder to reconcile when we behave in a way that doesn't align with our beliefs and our values. So that gap between who we are and how we act causes cognitive dissonance, right? And that makes us uncomfortable. We want that gap to disappear. And identity and self-consistency theory explains why, right? We have a fundamental drive to align what we do with who we think we are. And so when reflection or feedback reveals a gap, it creates a motivation to close that gap. And you can either do that by changing your beliefs to align with your behavior or changing your behavior to align with your beliefs. Something like identity priming can help to accelerate this. So you can remind somebody that they are a generous person, they are an environmentalist, um, they are, a community builder, um, and you can do this before, asking them to reflect or act, and then you reactivate that identity, and you can make their subsequent behavior much more likely to align. Um, and so I'll talk in a moment about next the test that we did with 1% for the planet, which opened with exactly this type of identity priming questions that were designed to surface and reinforce the participant's identity as somebody who cares about the planet. And then on top of everything, there's also this social dimension, right? So we don't reflect in a vacuum. Knowing what other people are doing, what others think we should be doing, that has a huge influence on the beliefs that we seek to align our behaviors to. So for example, showing a donor that most people in their peer group are doing XYZ, giving to this number of organizations, or a growing share of donors are giving more strategically or unrestricted funding. That sets a peer benchmark, which can shape social norms that people then adhere to. So lots going on here with feedback and reflection. But we know what they are, we know why it works now, but how do we actually apply these insights in practice? So reflection strategies are really about creating moments for donors to examine who they are as givers. So they can help donors gain a better sense of their preferences and priorities, understand their optimal giving approach, try something new, be more generous. And they can look like a lot of different things. It could be a quiz that prompts donors to reflect on themselves, an onboarding process that sort of prompts also reflection on values and preferences by asking questions. It could be an intake conversation with a philanthropic advisor, or even, a conversation with family members to reflect on shared priorities and goals, right? So that reflection is really about how can I hold a mirror up to myself? And just to quickly go through this little mini case study, so we did this project with 1% for the planet, and they had the kind of classic intention action gap problem, right? So they had a lot of subscribers who genuinely cared about the environment, but they weren't necessarily giving as much as they could as individual donors. Um, so we designed a reflection quiz to help close that gap, right? So the quiz did two things. First, it opened with identity reinforcing questions. So this sort of surfaced memories, values, self-perceptions, and this primed them to be receptive. And we tried to keep it really creative, right? I think we asked a question of like, if you were a bee, what kind of bee would you be, or something like that. So it was fun. It wasn't necessarily connected to giving. But then taking all of these responses to these questions, it assembled a giving archetype. So we had builder, strategist, or explorer. And these archetypes were based on how the participants answered the questions. And again, these seemed very playful, but on the back end, they were coded to really specific preferences and behaviors. Um, so here we were trying to do two things. On one hand, help them discover one of three potential engagement giving pathways with 1% for the planet that felt most authentic to who they were and aligned with their preferences, but also use the quiz as a way to help them discover something new about their own preferences and tendencies. So I really enjoyed this project. It was fun. And again, there was some interesting B-side work here, right? We had sort of identity, consistency, and self-image. So we wanted donors to reflect on how they saw themselves. Um, Self-perception theory. So that's sort of when individuals infer their own attitudes and traits by observing their own past behavior. So by asking donors to reflect on their past behavior, it helped paint a picture of who they were. And again, sort of leveraging cognitive dissonance very slightly by saying, oh, maybe you haven't given as often as you wanted to. And the results were pretty interesting. So obviously, not everybody took the quiz or gave, but everybody who donated did it within 24 hours of completing the quiz or receiving a follow-up email. So that's sort of the salience of the exercise was important. But there was one really interesting breakout finding from this experiment that we did that one donor received the quiz invitation. They never actually opened it, but they still made a five-figure gift, right? And that told us that the invitation alone to reflect, even if they didn't go through the exercise, was enough to activate that latent intent to give, right? So sometimes an invitation to reflect is also just a reminder, right? Which is a little bit of choice architecture. So that's a fun reflection case study that we did. And feedback, on the other hand, so this is if reflection is about holding a mirror up to yourself, feedback strategies are about holding a mirror up to somebody else, right? So showing a donor what they're giving actually looks like so that they can decide if it reflects what they actually care about. So these strategies can help close the intention action gap, can help donors understand their impact and build more of a giving practice. It can help donors make more recurring gifts, more frequent gifts, and also adopt a learning mindset, right? Or even take more risks. These could look like a year in review recap of past giving. I'll share a mini case study in a moment about that. And this could include anything from gift size, frequency, approach, grantee type. It could be delivered via email, dashboard, advisor conversation. So all of these things, they don't just have to take one format. It really depends on the context. Spotify Wrapped is a great example of this strategy, actually. And I think now a lot of brands have started doing year-end reviews. Not all of them are great, I will say. Um, it could also look like comparative data showing how a donor's giving compares to their peers, right? So again, bringing in that social proof and social norms piece. It could be a reminder of their past goals and an assessment of whether giving met them. So rather than using peers as a baseline, you can use the donor themselves as the baseline. That's a little bit more evaluative. You could bring in some personalization from the past strategies and make recommendations for future giving based on past behavior. Um, and again, you can bring in some peer effects and social comparison to prompt reflection and say, what are other people doing, not just how do you compare to them. So that's feedback in a nutshell. And a quick little mini case study here. Um, so, we were saying before, most donors get some form of, I wouldn't call it feedback, but response to their giving, right? It could be a tax receipt, a thank you email, maybe you get a year-end summary if you're lucky. But again, none of it is really comprehensive and it's not really designed to change behavior. A lot of it is for tax compliance. So it tells you what you did, but it doesn't actually care to look at the bigger picture of, what else you did and why it matters. So these three problems over here, right, on the left are really just one big problem, right? Giving kind of lacks the emotional and social infrastructure that a lot of other fields have, such as other financial behaviors, right? So there's too much disparate data. Um, there's no norm that says, like review your giving every January. Um, besides tax season, I guess. And there's really no warm glow that lasts long enough to drive planning, right? You're usually not sitting down to make a giving strategy right after you've made a gift. So the personal giving review was a concept that we designed to help fill that gap. And I actually do think this predated Spotify Wrapped, but Eleni, keep me honest there. Um, this was a tailored year in review that showed donors what their giving said about them, um, and used identity framing and badges to make it feel a little bit more meaningful rather than administrative. It surfaced peer comparison data to create a norm, ended with a prompt, so very behaviorally informed, right? And this was sort of designed around this hypothesis that feedback is most likely to change behavior when it's personal, comparative, and actionable. And you also want it to feel positive and forward looking and not like a critique of the past. So we tested this with a partner. We worked with a national DAF to design a year in review email with some feedback. Compared to the standard control email that went out, which is here on the screen, um, the year in review email that we sent out had quite a bit more information on it. It was a little more interesting, including creating urgency by highlighting the year to date, giving people the opportunity to change their stats for the year by getting in some gifts before the end of the year, priming the client's identities as philanthropists, making specific actions like contributing and donating more salient, strengthening norms, such as percentage of unrestricted grants, and providing a call to action. And we got some interesting results. So clients who received this email were more likely to contribute and grant out, depending on their account size and their behavior. This design resulted in an 11.6% increase in contribution rates. So people put more money into their DAF. The year in review did not lead to a statistically significant increase in granting across the board, but among clients who had a year-to-date contributions level that exceeded their granting level. So in other words, for people who had put more money into their DAF than they had granted out, there was a 7.9% increase in granting rates for those clients. So this did seem to be a motivator for people who had a bigger balance left than they wanted to, right? So what's interesting also about this design is that it made dollars contributed the most salient data point, right? It's up there at the top. So it's unsurprising that contributions were the most impactful resulting behavior. Had the design flipped the dollars granted and the dollars contributed, it's possible that we may have seen a different result by making a different kind of behavior more salient. So it's all about how you give the feedback, which is a great segue to Tony. So on that note, I will turn it over to Tony Macklin, who is an independent philanthropic advisor and the director of advisor practice for Daylight Advisors. We're thrilled to have Tony with us today. We've had the pleasure of working together for many years. We're working on a project together now, and I'm excited to hear his great insights about feedback and reflection. So
Thanks,
over
Julia.
to you, Tony.
Sure. For folks in the audience, I tend to wear two hats as a consultant. One is working directly with families and foundations as an independent philanthropic advisor, helping them in their philanthropic journeys. A lot of my role is reflection and feedback work. I'll talk about that in a second. And then part of my role is sort of field building. And I do a lot of that with the National Center of Family Philanthropy and Daylight Advisors, and dropping in a link to Daylight's certificate programs, including one that Daylight built with Ideas 42 on behavioral philanthropy. So if you want to get even deeper into this, there's a certificate available on that. Let's go to the next slide. So it's a little bit more about Daylight. They define the field as a firm of philanthropic advising, which is sort of an undefined field, even many years into it. Do convenings, create certificates and programs, have a resource called the DAF-opedia, which is a knowledge hub for people who are using DAFs or are seeking money from them. So you can look more about that on the website. Let's go to the next slide. So my work as a philanthropic advisor is with wealthy families and foundations and donor advised funds. I will say that most of that is in like 6 to 12-month spurts, so I don't get some of the ongoing relationships that folks have if they work for a foundation or if they're a major gift officer or work for a donor advised fund sponsor or something. So I have to sort of fit in some ways to help people reflect and think while I'm working with them. A lot of my work and a lot of philanthropic advisors' works is resetting the room because a family or a board may be sort of on a trajectory of how they talk about things or how they interact as an organization or as a board or as a family. And we're interrupting or disrupting those group dynamics to create more space for the quiet voices, diminish the louder voices, you know how this all works, folks in the audience, and also give them some time to actually put some time in for self-reflection right in the meeting, especially for people who are introverts or take more time to process things. And so the classic third bullet here of answer quietly this question or think about it for a minute or two then talk about it with somebody else in a pair, and then go to a small group, and then go to everybody. It gives people a chance to process and learn in different learning styles. Sometimes just even introducing that resets the relationships amongst the family members or the board members. So just small micro ways of starting it. And anybody can do that in any committee or any setting. That's called the 1 to 2 to 4 to all exercise, which you can find lots of places. Next slide. I ask a lot of questions about people's history of generosity and giving back, and certainly even fundraisers and gift planners can do the same thing. But something that ties back to what Julia said earlier, a lot of it is recentering the practice in their role and self-identity as somebody who is generous and helping other people. Almost always centered on that versus like, what's your grants that you have done, or what are the charitable gifts you've made? Because I want them to remind themselves about why they're doing this work in the first place. And then we can get to the transaction stuff later on. So these are sample questions that anybody can use. And if you all don't know the resources, I'll drop two more. New book, Neuro Giving, which has some great distillation of some of the same science that Ideas 42 has worked on, and a ton of really practical advice for fundraisers on asking good questions of generosity and self-reflection of donors. And then the classic Russell James, Encourage Generosity, who's done a ton of teaching to gift planners and major gift officers on how unlocking donor psychology. So follow those two links for more information on the how of it. But anybody can ask these kinds of generosity questions, and then open question, right? Step in, let them talk, ask lots of curiosity, follow-up questions. Don't try to rush to judgment. One of the worst things that advisors and fundraisers will do is try to jump in with a solution too early, or jump in and try to narrow the options down too soon. You really want people to live in that story of who they are as a generous person, or what inspired them, so you can tee them up for more generous stuff to come. It's a scientific term, right, Julia? Stuff to come. Next slide, please. So here's an example reflection exercise I use with families and foundations, and it's about their grant making. So we've gotten past the generosity part. Let's like, okay, let's go to the past year or two of your grant making. And this is like, how would you want nonprofits in the community to describe your philanthropy, your foundation? And ask them to say more about that. Usually, again, have them individually answer and then talk about it as a group. How would you want them to describe what it's like to approach and work with you? And so I'm trying to help them think about like, what is their identity of how they want to show up as a collaborator or a partner or as a donor to other organizations and community members. Oftentimes, not always, but often, how they want to be in a relationship with the community might look very different to how their grant making has ended up for many foundations. And those of you who are on the nonprofit side will know these kinds of grant making processes keep accumulating stuff over time. So they might start out simple, and then somebody says, oh, we need to learn this. And so they add this, and then they add this, and they add this, and suddenly that's complex. Or somebody else told them, well, you need to have 15 questions to really put nonprofits through the ringer. And the answer is the family, secret to you all nonprofits, the family only reads like a third of all the information a lot of the time. It's just like they only trigger in on what's really important to them. And so sometimes I'm taking them all the way back, like, what is it you really are trying to do here? And then stripping back all the grant making process to help them better learn from the organizations and reflect on things later. And so there's a lot of rejiggering of the grants, and I could say more about that. I had a family in Cincinnati that I worked with, and they'd been at it for about 20 years, a couple generations working as a family foundation. And as the younger generation was stepping in and the sort of middle generation was stepping up into full leadership, they realized that they'd overbuilt a grant making process, and it didn't reflect their identities as a generous family or the kind of brand that they would want their name attached to. So redid the process, cut out things by at least 2/3, I think. Next slide. Also, do a lot of embedding context into the conversations, as Julia said in multiple of these webinars. Donors, as much as they might feel like they're connected, usually are working in isolation or have sort of a narrow version of how philanthropy works or what philanthropy looks like, or their peer group in their head is something that is not a match for them. They might think, oh, Gates Foundation does this, so I should do this, or the big community foundation in Chicago or something, whatever the case may be. And so oftentimes I'm resetting their understanding of the context. Like, are you curious exploring about something? Because did you know that an increasing percent of donors do X? Are thinking about spend down foundations or donor advised funds as opposed to perpetuity? Or have you thought about ways that you may be in a spectrum of 4 options or 5 options? Oftentimes they may know the black and white ends of an option, but don't realize there's other paths in the middle of that. That's a lot of that's just sort of learned over time, but you can do the same thing, right? Realize that there's sort of a whole spectrum of ways that somebody can be a giver or be generous, and help them say like, oh, we're on number 3 of the spectrum and we're happy with that. Or no, we're at number 3. Actually, we'd rather be on number 5, and sort of give themselves along the way. I pull information from the National Center for Family Philanthropy survey of generous families. Exponent Philanthropy is another one that does surveys of foundations, counts on foundations. It's lots of places where I can say like, oh, the field of philanthropy, organized philanthropy, is changing. Let's talk about how other people are thinking about things these days. And always with that curiosity language. I don't come with them saying they have to do things one way, but is it working for them, or is it not working as well as they think it has? Let's go to the next slide. And the other thing that I've helped a few organizations or families design is an assessment and learning plan. You could Google that, or you would use whatever search engine and find 100 results, but I distilled this for the National Center of Family Philanthropy's assessment and learning module. And one is just like, what are the values and principles that are trying to guide the way that you're assessing and learning and evaluating what you're doing? So it's back to the why of it. What are they trying to do as a person or as a family or as an organization? Because sometimes the assessment process doesn't match those values. And then what is they're really trying to assess? And there's some reframing accountability in that, because they might start out saying, oh, we have to get grant reports from nonprofits, but like, well, are you actually assessing yourselves? Like, are you getting better as donors or as a family or as a board? How's your strategy? If you have a strategy, is that like working for you? So I try to layer in that there's other things they should be thinking about beyond sort of a grant by grant or organization by organization look, and normalize that lots of families are asking those questions. And what are your goals about evaluation and assessment? Is it really to inform your purpose? Are you trying to facilitate improvements? Are you trying to monitor results or evaluate impact? Same questions a nonprofit or a social enterprise would act itself. Again, sort of reframing accountability and changing where the feedback loops are, not just long-term or short-term, but it's probably a blend of all of them. And then how will you work with others to assess and learn? Again, resetting this doesn't have to be you're the only organization coming up with the only evaluation measures, learning only this thing for this organization. You could be learning alongside other donors. You could be learning alongside the nonprofits. You could be learning alongside people on the ground getting stuff done with those nonprofits. You could be learning alongside municipal officials, whatever. So help them think that they can be part of an ecosystem of change versus sort of an isolated, I get a grant report and I don't know what to do with it, how to act on it. Just reworked this for a foundation that's spending down, will be done in 4 years. And they've been on the sort of grant by grant learning trajectory, but as they were thinking about their spend down, they're making much larger grants, and the board's asking bigger questions like, what's the leave behind? How's the longer term impact going to look like this? And what does this mean for what we can document as a foundation and translate for other donors? So if they're building a whole sort of playbook on how other donors could spend down the way they're doing. And so it's a chance for them to be a shared learning resource, which was new for them. Next slide. And then the last thing that I've talked about with larger families or families with more means, but also staffed foundations, and nonprofits can again steal from this, is there somebody who acts as your informal chief learning officer, stealing this term from family offices or large companies? Like, who amongst the family members in a family foundation might help the family think about lifelong learning? Again, there's a long-term commitment maybe, and so how are you thinking about the kids learning, the teenagers, the 20-year-olds, the 30-year-olds, all the rest of it? Who explores the best learning styles for each family member, because everybody may have a different opinion on things, and who will facilitate and steward the learning and assessment agenda if you have one. Again, another family I worked with, they were in their three generations of family members, and it was a former teacher. She had just retired, and so she raised her hand and said, I can take that role. She already had an education background, and she was so excited to be that sort of internal resource for the family to say. So she did a poll with the family members like, we talked about all this stuff at the retreat. What do you want to do next? And so they did the poll and came up that. And then she teed up a webinar with somebody. She teed up a learning with another foundation. She asked me for some resources and they talked them through. And so she's taken that part on. She can make it as big or small as you want it. As somebody's thinking about it, you can do the same thing informally or formally within an organization. So you might think about that, like who's playing that role of constant reflection, constant learning, constant adapting versus sort of point in time, one time learning, and then you don't get back to it for a year or two. So a few things I get to do as an advisor to families, but many of it can be adaptable for nonprofits or other foundations or donor advised funds, I think.
Amazing.
That's the end of my slides, at least.
Thanks, Tony.
Sure.
Um, I love this chief learning officer role piece because I think, at you've described it as sort of like a very high touch way, and like this could be a specific person working within a family. But I think you can also think about it as like a role that you can take with yourself, right? Sometimes you need to be in learning mode and putting yourself in a reflection. And so it doesn't just need to be about like, oh, you should only think about doing this if you have like a family office and are super wealthy.
Yes.
It could
Yeah.
also, it's more about the idea behind it all. Um, so I guess on that note, I will, well, I'm going to kick us off with a few questions. For folks in the audience, please put any questions you have in the chat or in the Q&A. I'll get to them in a little bit. But first, I think just sort of as a segue on that point, um, you know, we've we've uh, we've talked a lot about in the series around sort of like how platforms and tools
Mm-hmm.
can use a lot of these strategies. A lot of the examples that you shared are much more high touch, one-on-one, sort of in the advisor um, client space. And in fact, a lot of your work is very deeply relational and one-on-one. I'm
Yeah.
wondering, this is a two-part question. First, sort of, what are some tips and tricks that folks who are maybe more in that low touch platformy space, what are some ways that they can extract learnings from everything that you just shared if they're
Mm-hmm.
operating in like a non one-on-one environment? And
Mm-hmm.
the second part of that question is sort of like, what gets lost when you move away from that relational
Yeah.
one-on-one space?
Uh, Um, so you could imagine like a nonprofit organization that's fundraising in the donation thank you page
Mm-hmm.
or message. They could embed some questions or a question or two like, how did that feel about making this kind of impact? You just helped 15 lives or something. And you could also do that as part of the self-reflection questions before you actually ask again. The
Mm,
sort of classic fundraising cycle is right. You thank somebody, you thank them again, you tell them the impact of their gift or at least multiple gifts, and before you get to that next ask, and somewhere in that middle, you could have those kind of self-reflection questions. How does it feel when you're part of a group that's made 1,000 lives different, or save the Amazon, or whatever the case is, and have them send you a note back or post it on social media. So again, it's just an invitation. Nobody's going to do it, but at least it's that power of invitation, right? You talked about earlier. Certainly, lots of the folks who are donor advised fund sponsors don't have the staff to do personalized work with all of their customers, but like your giving review that you had, you could embed some of
mm,
those self-reflection questions early on, and just maybe even as simply as post people's answers on their login page. You don't have to do anything with it, but just say like, here's what you said. My goal for giving this year is X. And that's at the top of their login page. And then you could have an automatic thing that comes 6 months later, like, how's it going on that? Or are there things that you want to do differently? So you can sort of automate the prompts, even if you can't staff the support of it. And
mm-hmm.
just the power of them thinking that you're paying attention. And then you get to the closer to the sort of the giving page that you said later on. So I think it's a way to automate it if you can't do it. You do lose my role and staff's role in being a bit of the coach or accountability
Mm,
coach to the donor if you're around enough to say like, hey, how is it going 6 months later, a year later, and or being the trusted advisor enough to push them when they're stuck or when they haven't answered things themselves deeply enough. So I'm there.
Mm,
They hire me as a professional advisor, and so I come in and I'm willing to push harder than maybe a staff person could or family members might be able to do it for themselves. And so use that ability to let people stretch into the possibilities of what they could do. So maybe they don't realize they can take that next step into self-reflection or learning.
yeah. Right, because fundamentally self-reflection is about creating the opportunity for someone to think, right? So you don't actually have to
Yes.
be there. But again, what they decide to do with that opportunity is up to them, especially if you're not there to provide that
Yep.
accountability.
Yep.
Um, so I mean, yeah, speaking of sort of what people are up to or up for, so the process you described with your clients, it seems, it's very structured, very facilitated approach, probably takes quite a bit of time. You're doing interviews before meetings,
Mm-hmm.
maybe spending quite a few hours together. How do you know when a donor is ready for that kind of deep reflection? And how do you know if it feels like too much too soon and you kind of have to ease in? Like, what are some clues?
Yeah. Um, Good financial advisors or CPAs, good gift planners know there's like a layer of questions. You sort of like have a tree in your head of where you can go down a rabbit hole with somebody or go deeply with somebody. So you've mentally parked that kind of tree into your head. Um, and so I'll sort of follow a list of questions they might have and skip some of them if they feel like they're not ready to go too deep into something or another, but I've opened the door. And so I might come back to the questions at a second meeting or a third meeting to see sort of where they feel comfortable. You can watch them get nervous or sort of halting in their answers. That said, again, because of my role as not the permanent insider, I'll push harder than maybe a staff person or somebody else
Mm,
could because I'm going to be gone at some point. And I have the freedom of, so they have the freedom of me of sometimes being more honest or more open than they might normally. And so sometimes I hear lots of stuff they wouldn't have normally talked about because they're on a roll and nobody's actually asked them the questions before.
yeah, and that's kind of right. I guess it's nice when you don't have a permanent role that also has
Yeah.
to do, um, you don't also have to be their best friend day to day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so I mean, and sort of building on that, right? Like these generosity legacy questions, they're all quite personal, right? You're talking about role models, joy, but asking people to really reflect on their own behaviors. Even if you think they're ready for the reflection, like how
Mm-hmm.
do donors typically respond to that level of introspection? Like what are some of the like varieties of reactions that you get when you do ask people to engage on this level?
Um, it's across the board as human beings. Like nobody wants to think about the end of their philanthropy at the end of their life or a legacy plan or a estate plan. So I tend to not get to that question or set of questions first off or in the first conversations. It's first about like all the story they're trying to build during their life and make sure they're clear about that. And then it may be another meeting after that where they are, uh, we've had a chance to talk about that and reflect back what they've been thinking about on that. And then say, like, tell me what happens when you're not around to take care of this. And the hedge I put that in is sometimes like, do you ever want to step away? Which is also a
Mm,
safer thing than what's going to happen when you die. Like, is there a time where you want to
yeah.
not do this as many hours as you're sticking in now? Um, or what happens if you're not going to be sort of fit healthy enough to do this, which is
Hmm.
code for maybe mentally incompetent, but people can read that as they need to. And so there's things before that to give them permission, like if you want to step away and get things organized even before you pass away and then get to the pass away. So there's sort of a longer staging on that. Most people know they're supposed to think about it, just like, they never talk to their insurance planner or estate planner about stuff. And so they're usually not surprised when I'm bringing it up at some point in the process. It's usually in my scope of work that says I'm going to bring these things up at some point unless they
Yeah.
exit out. Um, and if they say like I'm just not ready to do it, then I say okay, but know
Hmm.
that families like yours more and more, back to the norming, like families more and more you or
Yeah.
want to have this in place so that nobody's caught by surprise later, because it gets really messy when people are caught by surprise later and you don't want to leave that mess behind. And so they feel a little bit more
Yeah.
confident that way.
I love what a great example of reframing too. Like
Yeah.
not just what are you going to do when you die, but
Yeah.
what are you going to do when you don't want to do this anymore, right?
Yeah.
Like
The the
Some good
family in
B-side
Ohio
there.
the family in Ohio I was working with, like the oldest couple were there, like they'd
Yeah.
been hanging on the board for a while. I was like, when do you want to step away? He said, we've been thinking about that, but we didn't tell anybody. Like, it's okay. You've got a bunch of stuff in place. You've got a good thing in place. You can step away and be adjunct or emeritus or whatever you want to be.
Oh, that's funny. Um, okay, we're getting some questions in the chat
Yeah.
here. Um, so yeah, I think let's start with the first one. So this is our strategies, these sort of reflection and feedback strategies, effective in the international development space where funding comes from member states, multilaterals, and philanthropies. So I guess the question here would be um, really about like how do you translate these insights for institutional funders? Um,
Yeah, you can weigh on this too, Julia.
I,
I will
yeah,
say the cynical Tony Macklin
yeah,
says that institutions beat the humanity out of philanthropy, and so it can be much harder to do it when those kind of
yeah.
multinationals or big foundations. Um, but you have to talk to a human, hopefully, at some point in that relationship process. So I think going back to the why questions, even if they can't affect the entire institution, at least getting to know them as a human being, and say, why are you in this? What's made you excited? What was your background in it? They at least can maybe be a better emotionally connected advocate for you within the institution.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I think the same advice that I would give is that institutions are fundamentally made up of people, developing relationships with the program officer. And, I would also say it's not necessarily the responsibility of the grantee to give feedback to the funder. I think there are ways that institutions can take these insights and sort of build their own learning and evaluation um, philosophies around this internally. But also,
Yeah.
that sort of reminds me of a great example from some other work that we did in the education space. Um, I don't know, you might all be familiar with the FAFSA, which is the financial aid application, which is it's now been revised, but at the time it was still very complicated, 50 plus pages. We couldn't change the FAFSA form, but we designed, a folder with some cutouts on it that really highlighted only the things that were really important, that the applicant needed to fill out because everything
Yeah.
else was just a lot of IRS stuff. And so I think kind of taking that philosophy and saying, okay, can we, once you have a relationship with that program officer, can you really figure out a way to zero in on like only what's needed and sort of cut out a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
noise? Um, but yeah, I feel like we could have a whole other webinar on feedback and
Institutions. All right.
reflection for institutional funders. All right, we have a question from Cheryl for you, Tony. What synergies and challenges do you see most often when a family is navigating a generational leadership shift in their philanthropy?
Oh gosh, that's a whole nother webinar, and Cheryl knows that.
Yeah.
This, in the context of this webinar, um,
Mhm.
there's that tension point where the parent or grandparent generation feels like not they're not supposed to be learning anything anymore, like their pattern is set, and they've
Mm,
sort of self made themselves into out of the growth mindset, or they feel like they don't want to learn and make mistakes in front of the kids or grandkids. And at the same time, the kids and grandkids are very much in a learning mindset and oftentimes want to know like the mistakes mom and dad or grandma and grandpa made. So sometimes it's resetting, like the
yeah.
article I just dropped in at the end is like philanthropy is a verb, not a noun. You're not a philanthropist.
Mm,
You're always practicing philanthropy, and this idea of this is a lifelong learning journey. Nobody ever gets this right. Talk to anybody who's been at it. You're always learning and trying to figure things out. So sometimes it's the quiet set aside with the older generation, say like you all can reset this so that this is a learning experience, a valuable learning experience in the way that kids or grandkids learn as opposed to the way you learn. It's like that's part of it. There's lots of other governance and family dynamic stuff that are sort of out of kilter for this particular conversation.
mhm. Yeah, I love that. I think this it's the same thing in yoga, right? It's like yoga
Mm-hmm.
practice, and you don't
Mm-hmm.
do 15 classes and become a expert yogi. You're always improving. There's
Yeah,
always something you can improve.
yeah.
So I love that. We have a question from Millie. Also, it sounds like a lot of these approaches are um, more of like carrot in terms of encouraging people to move forward voluntarily. What have you seen in the stick approach and sort of either external factors cause somebody to move forward. So she thinks specifically external shifts such as the post George Floyd racial reckoning or pandemic giving.
Mhm.
Something, yeah. In your experience, how has that kind of feedback worked for donors?
Uh, yeah, it may just be, my client base over the past 10 plus years. Any of them who were around during the recession, 2008, 2010, um, had something to run on when 2020 hit. Not necessarily the full
Mm,
version of it. Like they knew that they had reacted in a certain way. And so I was able to have them call back and reflect whether there a crisis or if they'd been through a flood or something in their communities. And so many donors had been through some other version of a shock to their philanthropic strategy, whatever that might be. And so I can call them back to that. Um, and more of them were paying attention, even if they weren't acting as fast, say, in George Floyd or 2020. So I think it's some of the same questions. They're like, what did you learn the last time something big hit you and you hit communities of
mm,
causes you did, and did it feel like the right response or not for you, or did you feel like you could have gone faster or bigger or smaller or differently? And same normalization, like we've now had studies on how donors of different levels and families of different means react to these kinds of things. And I can ground them in. Lots of people jump in really quickly and their endowments still come back or they still have thin relationships. And so there's a lot of storytelling of like, it's okay to step out of your comfort zone if you haven't done it before, and reflect on what does it feel like to show up as a help guide. One of the foundations that I worked with in 2020 were asking themselves, what do we want people to be saying about us 3 years from now about how we reacted today? It was a great future casting question because they're like, we need to do something more than we've been doing. So that sort of external environment helps sort of move them forward, I guess, is the carrot and the stick.
yeah, I mean, I guess I would add to that too that sort of highlighting a cognitive dissonance is a great stick, I think, is
Yeah,
like letting people be their own critics, right? Often
yeah,
letting people be their own critics is much more effective than showing up with critiques, especially for sort of long-term change.
yes.
Um, all right. Well, time is just flying by here, Tony. I wish we could keep chatting, but I do have to close this out
Yeah,
because we do have just a couple of quick things that we want to share before we wrap at the hour. Thank you so, so much for joining us. This was as always, very, very insightful. It was so good to have you and stick around for the last 3 minutes. Um, so for everyone else who is staying on, because this is our last of the four webinars, so I did just want to close this out with a super quick recap and kind of end on an important insight, which is that the behavioral strategies that we shared up until now, attention discovery, curation, personalization, framing, choice architecture, reflection, and feedback, they are all really great ways to reduce friction along the donor journey, and help close that intention action gap that we keep talking about. But I do want to end on this note, right? Applied behavioral science is often a series of nudges, and we've given you a lot of examples of those here. And I don't say but, and it's also about seeing the big picture, right? Diagnosing along that whole arc of the donor journey as many possible points of failure that you can, and trying to really redesign the experience holistically, not just at different nudge points along the way. So if there's one thing that I hope you'll take away from this is that it is both a micro tool and a macro tool. Um, and we would love to hear from you if you think there are opportunities for us to work together to apply BSI in your context. Couple of super quick announcements. Again, please, please, please take the survey. We love feedback. It's so great for us. Tony loves it too. And so please take that. We'll drop that in the chat. And then two very quick announcements here. So we are closing out our Generosity by Design webinar series with this session, but we do have a separate webinar happening in 2 weeks on June 10th. We'll be launching our local Giving by Design catalog, which is a new resource for DAF providers and giving platforms to help increase grant making to community-based organizations. We'll have another Tony Bowen, as guest on that webinar. And finally, if you're going to be in New York on July 13th, please join us. Ideas 42 Civil Society team is having a happy hour for our giving and civic engagement colleagues across New York and beyond. If you're local, please stop by or tell your New York colleagues or come and see us just for this. Um, and stay in touch. Thank you again, Tony. It was such a pleasure to have you. Please feel free to reach out, everyone, and we'll be following up with the recordings to all 4 sessions and the decks as well for the series. Um, thank you all for joining and have a great rest of your day.